Alfred Packer, the man-eater of Colorado. A fateful journey. In the annals of American frontier history, few figures evoke such controversy and intrigue as Alfred G. Packer, known for his alleged crimes and for the desperate circumstances that may have driven him. His name continues to inspire debate. Was he a cold-blooded murderer, or merely a man forced to make an unimaginable choice in the face of starvation? Opinions remain divided, with some in Colorado even viewing him as a sort of local folk hero, despite the gravity of the accusations against him. Packer's story, muddled by contradictory accounts, has been recounted in various books, newspapers, and official records, each offering a slightly different version of events. At the heart of each is Packer himself, a man whose own shifting narratives have only added to the enigma. In November 1873, Packer, then 31, joined a group of prospectors who set out from Bingham Canyon, Utah, with the hopes of striking it rich in the San Juan Mountains of Colorado. Packer claimed to be the guide for this expedition, although evidence suggests this might have been an exaggeration, if not an outright fabrication. As they ventured deeper into the rugged wilderness, misfortune struck, their food supplies dwindled, and desperation began to set in. By January 1874, the group had found refuge at Chief Urey's Ute camp near present-day Montrose, Colorado. The Ute people, known for their wisdom and survival skills, offered the prospectors food and shelter, strongly advising them to wait until the spring before continuing their journey. The mountain passes, they warned, were treacherous in winter, with deep snow capable of burying even the most experienced travelers. Yet, driven by the allure of potential riches, 5 of the prospectors, alongside Packer, decided to press on. Ignoring Chief Urey's advice, they left on February 9th, hoping to reach the Los Pinos Indian Agency near Gunnison, Colorado. It was a perilous decision, one that would ultimately lead to disaster. The group, including 18-year-old George California Nunn, set off into the mountains with only 10 days' worth of provisions, tragically unaware that their destination lay much farther than they believed. Months passed, and there was no sign of the men. By mid-April, Packer stumbled into the Los Pinos Agency alone, looking remarkably well-fed for someone who claimed to have survived the harsh winter wilderness. Oddly, though he stated he hadn't eaten in days, his first request was not for food, but for whiskey. More curiously, he was found in the possession of multiple wallets, each containing money belonging to the missing man. Questions quickly arose, and Packer's shifting explanations did little to quell the suspicion. Soon, rumors circulated, rumors of theft, murder, and even cannibalism. The truth of what had transpired in the mountains would remain elusive for years to come. Packer's confession. It wasn't long before the pressure on Packer mounted. A month after his arrival at the Los Pinos Indian Agency, under growing suspicion, Packer gave his confession on May the 8th, 1874, to General Charles Adams. His account of the ill-fated journey was a harrowing tale of starvation, bitter cold, and desperate choices. According to Packer, the small group had been overwhelmed by the brutal conditions almost immediately. The weather was unforgiving, and with their provisions quickly depleted, the men found themselves trapped in the snow-covered wilderness. Packer claimed they had no means to fish in the frozen lakes, and wild game was nowhere to be found. As the situation grew increasingly dire, their hope of survival began to fade. In his confession, Packer recounted that Israel Swan, the oldest member of the group at around 65, was the first to succumb to starvation, dying roughly 10 days after they left Chief Urey's camp. In a grim act of survival, the others made the difficult decision to consume Swan's remains, a decision that was to be repeated as the party continued to lose members to the harsh conditions. 4 or 5 days after Swan's death, James Humphrey perished, and like Swan before him, his body became a source of sustenance. Packer admitted to taking $133 from Humphrey's pockets, reasoning that the dead man had no further need for it. As disturbing as this may seem to modern sensibilities, it reflects on the harsh realities these men faced in the wilderness, where survival often took precedence over social norms. Next, Frank Miller, whom Packer referred to as the Butcher, died under mysterious circumstances. Packer claimed that Miller had suffered an accident while he was out searching for firewood. By the time Packer returned, Miller's body had already been partially consumed by the others. The youngest member of the group, 18-year-old George Nunn, was the next to die. According to Packer, Shannon Wilson Bell shot Nunn while Packer was away hunting. Packer returned to find Bell engaged in the now familiar grim task of preparing the remains for food. With only Packer and Bell left alive, the tension between the two men began to escalate. Packer claimed that Bell soon turned violent, attacking him with a rifle in a desperate bid to become the sole survivor. In the struggle that followed, Packer managed to overpower and kill Bell in self-defense. Alone in the wilderness, Packer was left with no choice but to rely on the remains of his companions for survival. Why Packer hadn't shared this account upon his arrival at the Los Pinos agency remained unclear. In his confession, Packer swore that this was the truth, so help me God. A search party was soon dispatched, with Packer reluctantly guiding them to where he believed the bodies of his companions lay. However, the search was unsuccessful. Whether due to deep snow or Packer's own lack of cooperation, the bodies were not found. Packer was promptly arrested and jailed in Saguache, Colorado, on suspicion of murder. His story, while compelling, did little to convince the authorities of his innocence. For many, the emerging evidence painted a far darker picture of what had transpired in those mountains. A grisly discovery. In August of 1874, a discovery was made that cast doubt on Packer's version of events. John A. Randolph, an artist on assignment for Harper's Weekly, stumbled upon a grisly scene at Slum Gully and Pass near Lake City, Colorado. There, near the banks of the Lake Fork of the Gunnison River, he found the remains of 5 men, huddled together as though they had met their deaths in close proximity to one another. Randolph immediately suspected these were the missing prospectors. Although some sources claim that a road building crew had found the bodies earlier, Randolph's discovery remains the most widely accepted account. Among the skeletal remains, Randolph noted that several appeared to have been subjected to acts of violence. One was missing a head, and others had clear evidence of flesh being removed. The chilling details confirmed the worst fears of those who had doubted Packer's confession. The coroner, W.F. Ryan, along with 20 other men, hurried to the scene to conduct an inquest. Strangely, no formal written report was ever produced, and the full details of the coroner's observations have been lost to history. Nevertheless, a member of the original party, Preston Nutter, was able to identify the remains of his former companions, confirming that Frank Miller was the one whose head was missing. With the bodies now buried near the site where they were found, a grim chapter of Colorado's history seemed to close. The location became known as Dead Man's Gulch, and Randolph's sketches would forever immortalize the macabre scene. However, Packer's fate was far from sealed. Just as questions about his guilt reached a fever pitch, he escaped from jail, disappearing into the vast wilderness. His whereabouts remained unknown for nearly 9 years. Alfred or Alfred? One of the curious details surrounding Alfred Packer is the confusion over his name. While official records, military documents, and even his tombstone list him as Alfred G. Packer, there is evidence to suggest that he sometimes spelled his own name as Alfred. It is said that during his time in the military, Packer had his name tattooed on his arm, and whether it was a mistake by the tattoo artist or a deliberate choice remains unclear. Amused by the error, Packer supposedly adopted the alternate spelling. In fact, even in the invitations to his trial and eventual execution, they used the name Alfred. Born in Allegheny County, Pennsylvania, on November 21st, 1842, although some records suggest January 21st, Packer learned the cobbler trade as a young man. When the American Civil War broke out, he was of the right age to enlist, which he did twice. Unfortunately, both times his service was cut short due to his battle with epilepsy, a condition that led to his honorable discharge from the military. After his time in the army, Packer drifted westward, seeking opportunity in the mining camps. He claimed to have gained enough experience driving ore wagons to become a guide for prospecting expeditions. However, as subsequent events would reveal, Packer's knowledge of the region he claimed to be guiding through was questionable at best. His decision to escape from jail rather than face a fair trial for the deaths of his companions left many convinced of his guilt. Nevertheless, with the wilderness at his disposal and a knack for survival, it seemed likely that Packer could evade justice indefinitely. Months passed, then years, with no sign of the so-called man-eater of Colorado. Caught. Alfred Packer's ability to remain at large came to an abrupt end in 1883, 9 years after his escape. During his time on the run, Packer had assumed the name John Schwartz and managed to live undetected. How he survived those years remains a mystery, but in March of that year his luck ran out. A former member of the original party of prospectors, Frenchy Cabezon, happened to recognize Packer's distinctive laugh in a saloon in Fort Fetterman, Wyoming. Cabezon alerted the authorities, and Packer was arrested just 300 miles from where his fugitive journey had begun. Upon his capture, Packer offered a second confession, once again to General Charles Adams, recounting the now familiar tale of starvation and survival. Packer's new confession largely mirrored his earlier one, with a few additional details. He explained that after leaving Chief Urey's camp, the group had encountered a fierce snowstorm that made progress nearly impossible. Their provisions, he said, lasted only a few days. By the 10th day, the men were surviving on little more than pine gum and rosebuds, and desperation began to take hold. In this version, Packer reiterated that it was Shannon Bell who had turned violent, killing the others in a fit of madness. Bell, he claimed, had attacked him as well, forcing Packer to kill him in self-defense. Once again, Packer confessed to eating the flesh of his fallen companions in order to survive. But he emphasized that he had only done so out of absolute necessity, and whether the jury would believe him this time remained to be seen. Tried for murder. Alfred Packer's first trial began on April 6, 1883 in Lake City, Colorado. He stood accused of murdering Israel Swan, the eldest of the 5 prospectors. The trial quickly became a spectacle, drawing attention from across the region. The prosecution focused on the evidence found at the scene, the position of the bodies, the wounds inflicted on the victims, and Packer's contradictory accounts of what had happened. Witnesses, including Preston Nutter, who had identified the remains, testified to the grisly conditions in which the bodies were found. Each of the 5 men had suffered traumatic injuries, including hatchet wounds to the head. Notably, Swan's remains showed evidence of a violent struggle, raising questions about Packer's claim of self-defense. While Packer took the stand in his own defense, his testimony did little to help his case. He offered conflicting details about his military service and his experience as a guide. Most damning, however, was his inability to explain why so many of the bodies bore clear signs of deliberate violence. On April 13, 1883, Friday the 13th no less, Packer was found guilty of premeditated murder. Judge Melville B. Jerry, who presided over the trial, handed down a sentence that would become infamous in local lore. While legend holds that Judge Jerry delivered a fiery, colourful rebuke, condemning Packer for reducing the local Democratic population, the court records suggest a more solemn approach. Judge Jerry expressed his belief that the murders were motivated by robbery, not survival or self-defense, and he urged Packer to prepare himself for the dread certainty of death. With those words, Alfred Packer was sentenced to hang. A second trial and a reprieve. Despite being sentenced to death, Alfred Packer's story did not end with his conviction. In 1885, 2 years after his sentencing, the Colorado Supreme Court overturned the verdict on a technicality. Packer had been tried for a crime that occurred when Colorado was still a territory. But by the time of his trial, the state had become part of the Union. As such, the legal grounds for his conviction were invalid, and Packer was granted a new trial. This second trial, held in 1886 in Gunnison, Colorado, presented a somewhat different set of charges. Instead of being retried for murder, Packer was charged with voluntary manslaughter for the deaths of all 5 men. Despite the change in the legal approach, the outcome was much the same. Packer was once again convicted, though this time his sentence was considerably lighter. He was sentenced to 40 years in prison, 8 years for each of the 5 deaths. Even with this conviction, Packer maintained his innocence regarding the circumstances surrounding the deaths of his companions. In 1897, he penned a letter to the Denver Rocky Mountain News, offering yet another version of events. This account placed greater emphasis on the desperation of the group as they struggled through the snow-covered mountains. Packer claimed that after days without food, the men resorted to eating their rawhide moccasins to stave off hunger. He described the extreme cold and isolation that had driven some of the party mad, with Shannon Bell again taking on the role of the aggressor. In this telling, Parker insisted that he had killed Bell in self-defense after discovering that the man had already murdered the others. He described the horror of being left alone with the bodies of his comrades, and how he had been forced to rely on their remains for sustenance in a situation that defied normal moral codes. Though the public's appetite for tales of cannibalism and frontier survival ensured that Packer's various accounts were widely read, they did little to alter the legal or popular view of him as a dangerous man. However, public opinion of Packer began to shift in the years that followed, with some individuals, including a prominent journalist named Polly Pry, campaigning for his release. The Man-Eater's Last Days. In the early 20th century, after serving nearly 16 years in prison, Alfred Packer's fortunes took a final turn. Thanks to the tireless efforts of Polly Pry and other advocates who believed that Packer had been unjustly treated, the aging convict was granted parole in 1901. By this time, Packer's health had deteriorated significantly. He was suffering from Bright's disease, a serious kidney condition that made further confinement hazardous to his well-being. His deteriorating physical condition played a large role in the decision to release him. Packer spent his remaining years living a quiet life, far from the public eye. He took a job as a guard for the Denver Post newspaper, but soon moved to Deer Creek Canyon in Jefferson County, Colorado, where he spent his time managing 2 small mining claims. Neighbors who met him in these later years described him as a kindly, if eccentric old man, known for telling stories of his adventures in the wilderness. Despite his newfound freedom, Packer's health continued to decline. In late 1906, a state game warden found him unconscious near his home. He was taken into the care of a local woman, Mrs. Van Alstyne, who looked after him during his final months. And on April 23, 1907, Alfred Packer passed away, officially listed as having died from a stroke brought on by trouble and worry in one final unfulfilled gesture. Packer wrote to the governor of Colorado, requesting a full pardon. His request went unanswered. Though Packer's life ended quietly, the legend of the Man-Eater of Colorado lived on. He was buried with military honors in Littleton, Colorado due to his military service during the Civil War, and his grave became a site of interest for those fascinated by his notorious story. Supporters continued to claim that Packer had been the victim of extraordinary circumstance, and that his actions, though morally questionable, were driven by the sheer will to survive. Another look at the victims. Packer's story might have faded into history, but in 1989, A forensic investigation brought his case back into the spotlight. James E. Starrs, a professor of law and forensic science, decided to re-examine the remains of Packer's ill-fated companions. Starrs organized an archaeological dig at the site where the bodies had been buried over a century earlier. Using modern forensic techniques, the team hoped to uncover new evidence that might clarify whether Packer had acted in self-defense as he had claimed, or whether he had indeed committed murder. The team successfully uncovered the remains of the 5 men, laid out side by side in shallow graves. Though time and the elements had worn away much of the evidence, the bones still held close. Some showed signs of blunt force trauma to the head, while others bore defensive wounds, suggesting a violent end. Starrs believed that the injuries were consistent with Packer's earlier confession of hatchet wounds, though he also noted marks on the bones that indicated the removal of flesh, a disturbing reminder of the cannibalism that had forever marked Packer's legacy. Starrs publicly stated that he believed Packer had indeed committed murder based on the forensic evidence. However, not all of the members of his team agreed with his conclusion, and debate over Packer's guilt or innocence continues to this day. The legend lives on. Even long after his death, Alfred Packer's legacy has remained part of Colorado folklore. In an ironic twist, the University of Colorado at Boulder named its student cafeteria the Alfred Packer Memorial Grill, a tongue-in-cheek nod to the man who survived under dire circumstances by consuming his fallen companions. The menu even proudly boasted, "Have a friend for lunch." Packer's story has also inspired popular culture, with several adaptations making light of the grim tale, notably Cannibal the Musical, a satirical film made by the creators of South Park, retells Packer's story in a darkly comedic fashion. Despite its morbid subject matter, the film reflects the strange fascination people continue to have with Packer's life and the unusual circumstances of his survival. Roadside attractions near Lake City, Colorado, where the events took place, cater to tourists interested in the macabre history of the area. Visitors can traverse the so-called Cannibal Trail, lined with caricatures of Packer and his companions. Meanwhile, the Hinsdale County Museum displays relics from the case, including the shackles Packer wore during his imprisonment, and a fragment of skull purported to belong to one of his victims. As the years pass, Alfred Packer's tale endures as a bizarre chapter in American history. Thousands of visitors still pay their respects to his gravesite in Littleton, Colorado. Here his tombstone identifies him as Alfred Packer, CO F-16 U.S. Infantry, acknowledging his military service, while his darker legacy remains an indelible part of the folklore surrounding him. While scholars and laypeople alike continue to debate whether Packer was truly guilty of the horrific crimes for which he was imprisoned, his story serves as a reminder of the extreme conditions faced by early settlers and the lengths to which one might go to survive. Whether viewed as a villain or a man driven to madness by starvation, Alfred Packer's name is unlikely to be forgotten anytime soon. But let us know in the comments whether you think this was cold-blooded murder or just an act of desperation. And thank you for joining us.